They say every neighborhood has that one guy who takes the HOA too seriously. But ours had Doyle Mason. This man strutted around like he wore a badge clipboard tucked under one arm, phone always ready to snap photos. He wasn't elected. He wasn't even appointed. He just decided one day that he was the neighborhood's self-proclaimed HOA patrol. And last week he crossed a line that Grandpa wasn't about to let slide. Before we dive in, comment which country you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. It started with the soft creak of our backyard fence at 5:30 in the morning. I was still groggy, pouring cereal, when Grandpa, sitting in his old rocking chair on the porch, muttered, "There he goes again." Sure enough, there was Doyle scaling our fence like some wannabe burglar, phone in hand, snapping pictures of Grandpa's tomato plants. He claimed they violated community aesthetics. Can you imagine that? A 75-year-old war veteran growing a few tomato vines in his backyard. Apparently that was a crime against the neighborhood's beauty code. I wanted to rush out there and tell him off, but Grandpa simply raised a hand and said, "Patience. Let a fool show himself long enough and he'll write his own ending." That was Grandpa's way. Calm, strategic, never the kind to blow up over nonsense. Doyle, on the other hand, was the opposite. High-strung, twitchy, desperate for attention. This wasn't even the first time Doyle had trespassed. Twice before we caught him snooping near our shed. Once he even rattled the lock, like he expected to find something illegal inside. Grandpa had reported him to the HOA board both times, but the president, Linda Clay, brushed it off with a dismissive smile. "Oh, Doyle's just enthusiastic," she said. "He cares about the neighborhood." Enthusiastic. Right, the man was practically breaking state trespassing laws, under North Carolina Statute 1459.113, but the HOA hid behind technicalities, calling it an internal enforcement issue. Grandpa wasn't buying it. He called the sheriff's office himself, and while they sympathized, they explained the gray area. Unless we caught Doyle in the act and pressed charges on the spot, it would just be our word against his. That's when Grandpa decided he'd had enough. For the next 3 days he disappeared into the garage, humming old country tunes while I fetched him tools. Sparks flew, metal clanged, and he didn't say a word about what he was building. By the 4th day, our wrought iron gate had a new upgrade, low voltage electric wiring. Perfectly legal under state code, as long as it was clearly marked. Grandpa made sure of that. He even posted a bright yellow sign that read, "Point rigueur, warning, electrified gate, trespassers will be shocked, point rigueur." Then, we waited, and right on schedule, Doyle came prowling again before dawn, clipboard in one hand, flashlight in the other, muttering about violations. Grandpa sat on the porch, sipping his black coffee like it was just another morning. I crouched by the window, my heart thudding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Doyle climbed the fence, boots crunching against gravel, and reached for the gate latch. Snap! A quick jolt of current surged through his gloved hand, and he yelped like a startled dog, jerking backward and landing flat on his backside in the dirt. His flashlight went flying, and he scrambled to his feet, limping toward the street while mumbling curses. Grandpa didn't move an inch. He just leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting beneath his hat, and said quietly, "That, son, is the sound of justice." By sunrise, the entire street had heard about it. Word spread fast. Doyle Mason, the self-appointed HOA enforcer, had shocked himself on Old Man Thompson's gate. Neighbors whispered in driveways, stifling laughter, while Doyle tried to spin the story like he was the victim. He told anyone who would listen that Grandpa had installed an illegal death trap, but everyone knew the truth. Doyle had been snooping for months, sneaking into backyards, measuring people's grass with a ruler, even peeking through curtains at night. The man was a walking privacy violation, and for once, he got exactly what he deserved. Still, Doyle wasn't the type to take humiliation quietly. By noon, an emergency HOA meeting was called. Grandpa went, and I tagged along, just in case things got heated. What followed wasn't just a meeting, it was a showdown. The community center was packed that afternoon. Folding chairs lined the walls, ceiling fans hummed lazily, and neighbors whispered in tight little clusters. Everyone knew this wasn't just another HOA meeting. At the front sat Linda Clay, the HOA president, pearls glinting under the fluorescent lights, her signature fake smile plastered on her face. And right beside her sat Doyle Mason, arm in a sling for dramatic effect, face red as a tomato. He was ready to put on a show. The moment the meeting started, Doyle shot up from his seat, pointing at Grandpa like he was exposing a criminal. "This man," he barked, "is endangering our neighborhood. He's installed an electrified weapon. That gate nearly killed me. You could have heard a pin drop." Grandpa didn't move, didn't even blink. He calmly reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and laid it on the table in front of Linda. "That, Mrs. Clay," he said in his low, steady voice, "is a state-certified permit, fully legal, clearly signed, and yes, I posted the required warning sign." He leaned back, hands folded on his cane, like a man who had nothing to prove. Linda's smile twitched. "Legal or not," she said, "it's aggressive, Mr. Thompson. It goes against the spirit of community living. The HOA reserves the right to regulate installations. That's when Grandpa's voice dropped into that deep gravelly tone that always made people sit up straighter. Regulate? Sure. Trespass? No. North Carolina law makes it a crime to enter private property without consent, and this man's done it 3 times. I'm done warning him. Next time I'll let the sheriff handle it. The room went still. You could feel the shift, the kind of quiet that happens when people realize they've been complicit in nonsense for too long. Then, from the back, a woman stood up. He came into my backyard last month, she said. Said my shrubs were too tall. I thought I was the only one. Another voice joined in. He took pictures of my kids' bikes and said they were an eyesore. Then another, and another. Every new voice chipped away at Doyle's fake authority. The color drained from his face as more neighbors shared their stories, his so-called inspections, his rude comments, his constant harassment. Linda banged the gavel, desperate to regain control. This is not the place for accusations. We're here to discuss Mr. Thompson's, but Grandpa interrupted, slow and firm. No ma'am, we're here to discuss Doyle's obsession. You let him run this neighborhood like it's his personal kingdom, and now he's learned what happens when he steps on the wrong porch. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. For once, the neighborhood wasn't laughing behind Grandpa's back. They were nodding, agreeing, even applauding quietly. Doyle's lips tightened, his jaw clenched. He looked around the room, expecting support, but all he found were crossed arms and cold stares. The self-proclaimed enforcer had become the villain of his own story. By the end of the meeting, Linda could barely hold the floor together. She closed with a half-hearted statement about maintaining harmony, but it was clear, the power had shifted. Doyle wasn't feared anymore, he was mocked. And Grandpa, he didn't gloat, didn't say a word on the way home. He just sat on the porch that evening with his thermos of black coffee, gazing down Maple Court as the sun dipped behind the trees. You see, kid, he finally said, voice soft, some fights you don't win by shouting, you win by letting the truth walk out in the open. But Doyle wasn't finished, not by a long shot. For 2 days straight, he circled our block in his dented pickup like a hawk that had lost its prey, slow, vengeful, waiting for an opening. Every few hours, he'd stop at our gate, stare for a moment, and drive off again. Grandpa barely looked up, just sipped his coffee, eyes calm, steady, unbothered, but I could tell, he was waiting. Because Grandpa knew something I didn't yet. A man like Doyle never quits until he destroys himself. And that destruction was coming sooner than anyone expected. The third night after the meeting, the air was thick and heavy, the kind that made every sound travel farther than it should. The streetlights along Maple Court flickered, casting long shadows across the yard. Grandpa sat in his rocking chair as always, thermos in hand, that quiet look of patience written all over his face. But there was something different tonight. His eyes weren't wandering. They were fixed, sharp, steady, on the gate. Around midnight, I woke to the faint sound of rustling, then a low clink. I crept to my window and peered through the blinds. There he was, Doyle Mason, flashlight in one hand, bolt cutters in the other, mumbling curses under his breath. He wasn't there to take pictures anymore. He was there for revenge. I could barely breathe as I watched him kneel beside the gate, trying to cut through the wiring Grandpa had installed. His hands shook as the metal bit into the steel frame. That's when I heard Grandpa's voice from the porch, calm, low and steady. Watch this, kid. He pulled a small black remote from his pocket, thumb resting on the button. The old man didn't even flinch as he pressed it. Zap! A sharp crack filled the night as the electric current surged through the gate. Doyle's whole body stiffened, then jerked like he'd grabbed a live hornet nest. His flashlight flew into the mud. He stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet, landing face first in the dirt. A loud, panicked yelp escaped his throat. Grandpa didn't move, didn't even raise his voice. He just took a slow sip of his coffee and muttered, trespassing again. Then, calm as ever, he lifted his phone camera already recording. Every stutter, every curse, every pitiful attempt Doyle made to stand back up, captured in full 1080p. Doyle finally managed to pull out his own phone, still trembling, and screamed into it, 911. Within minutes, red and blue lights washed across the yard. The sound of sirens broke the silence as 2 sheriff's cruisers rolled up the driveway. Officers stepped out, hands resting on their holsters, eyes moving between Grandpa calm, collected, still sitting in his chair, and Doyle covered in mud, shaking like a leaf. One officer spoke first. Sir, is there an active electrical device on that gate? Grandpa nodded slowly. Yes, sir. Registered, permitted, posted with warnings and recorded. He slid the laminated permit across the porch table without even standing up, then handed over his phone. The officers watched the video, Doyle scaling the fence, gripping the cutters and shocking himself all in glorious HD. One of them looked up at Doyle, expression flat. So you trespassed? Doyle's jaw dropped. No, I was conducting an inspection for the HOA. The second officer raised an eyebrow. At midnight, with bolt cutters, you could feel the air shift again, the same way it had back at the meeting. The difference was, this time Doyle didn't have a crowd to hide behind.
Under state code it was clear as day. He was guilty of criminal trespassing, vandalism, and attempted theft for tampering with private property. And that 911 call, a false police report, another charge stacked on top. They cuffed him right there in front of the glowing gate. Doyle tried to protest, screaming about conspiracies, corruption, and dangerous old men with traps, but nobody was buying it. The officers guided him to the cruiser as he stumbled and cursed, shoes slipping in the mud. By then, half the neighborhood had come outside. Porch lights flicked on up and down the street. People stood in pajamas, whispering, watching as Doyle Mason, the self-appointed HOA cop, was escorted away in handcuffs. And then something unexpected happened. The clapping started, soft at first, one or two neighbors, then louder, spreading through the street until it filled the night. Grandpa didn't stand, didn't bow. He just smiled faintly, tipped his hat, and took another sip of coffee. "Sometime, son," he said, eyes on the flashing lights. "Justice just needs a little electricity." Doyle sat in the back of the cruiser, drenched in sweat and shame, his precious HOA clipboard left behind in the mud, his authority gone, his reputation shattered. As the patrol car rolled down Maple Court, Grandpa's gate buzzed softly behind him, a quiet reminder that boundaries once crossed have a price. The next morning the neighborhood felt different, peaceful. Linda Clay resigned a week later. The HOA meeting suddenly got shorter. And Grandpa's tomato plants, they flourished like never before, bright red and defiant. Word spread far beyond Maple Court, not just about Doyle Mason's downfall, but about the old veteran who finally stood his ground. Because in a world full of people who think power gives them permission, Grandpa proved something simple, timeless and true. Respect isn't enforced with rules, it's earned with decency. And if someone like Doyle ever forgets that lesson again, well, the sign on the gate still says it all. Trespassers will be shocked. Trespassers will be shocked.